Hello, welcome to Wealth in Our Democracy, Anand Giridharadas in a Conversation. This is a part of our virtual International Festival of Arts and Ideas. My name is Elizabeth Nearing, and I'm the curator of ideas programming this year. The International Festival of Arts and Ideas is created and produced on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac in the land we call home, Connecticut. I hope that from wherever you are, take a moment and acknowledge and honor the Native people whose lands you're on and the history of the place you're in. There's a link to find out more about Native land near you. This year, as we were creating our Democracy, We the People programming, we worked with fellow organizations, New Haveners, and thought partners of all kinds. I want to thank everybody who's come along with us on this journey. Throughout, we met with folks to ask them to fill in the blank. We can't talk about democracy in New Haven if we don't talk about blank. And wealth inequality came up every time. So this conversation today is an opportunity for us to dive in deeper with experts. So we'd love to continue centering your thoughts, your questions, what you're curious about throughout. If you have thoughts, ideas, pop them in the comments and we'll do our best to include your thoughts throughout the talk. As a part of our ideas series, we're working closely with Connecticut Humanities with support from the Whitney Center and media support from Connecticut Public. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight. We're welcoming John Dankosky and Anand Giridharadas. John has a few projects coming up this week. With the Connecticut Mirror, his podcast, Steady Habits, is kicking off a series of conversations about reopening Connecticut. And he's hosting an Ask the Mirror virtual event tomorrow night. You can find out more at ctmirror.org. And this Saturday from 3 to 5 p.m., he's co-hosting a national call-in special called America Amplified, Life, Community, and COVID-19. You can listen on New England Public Radio or nepr.net. Anand is the author of most recently Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World. You can purchase it at local New Haven bookstores, including People Get Ready, Atticus Bookstore and Cafe, RJ Julia's, and many more. You can also see a link in the comments. He is the editor-at-large for Time, an on-air political analyst for MSNBC, and he has a new TV show, A Seat at the Table, on Vice. And without any further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome John and Anand. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Well, thanks so much for having us. This is going to be a lot of fun. And of course, we've got comments coming through this entire conversation. So we're going to try to get some of those comments in there. Anand, it's good to talk with you. First of all, thanks for being here.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm kind of where I always am. So in a way, it's easier.
I guess it's a lot easier these days. I want to talk about wealth and inequality. And I want to talk about the topic of your new book. And I think I want to start off with a really great object example of what you talk about in Winners Take All. And it happened just in Connecticut today, as a matter of fact. Some news coming from the Connecticut Mirror. I'm just going to read from my colleagues here. It says, Governor Ned Lamont announced the dissolution Tuesday of Connecticut's education partnership with hedge fund giant Ray Dalio's philanthropic group, a deal marred by transparency issues and oversight scandals. Less than 1 year after its creation, the final straw appears to be centered on Dalio officials' efforts to remove the partnership's executive director days before state lawmakers had been notified about the problem. So I won't go into all the details on it, but you've written quite a bit about efforts like this, where really, really rich people want to do something really, really good to help the people of the place where they live. And the Dalio Foundation, in many ways, was trying to do that, putting in $100 million, asking the state to kick in $100 million, leveraging more private money to try to help transform education in the state. It didn't work, and we can get into some of the reasons why, but this seems so emblematic of exactly the sort of thing that you've been following. What's so wrong in your mind with this sort of effort by a guy like Ray Dalio?
If the rich and powerful giving back were going to save us, Connecticut would have been saved by now. America would have been saved by now. And the Dalio thing, I'm so glad you brought it up. I haven't thought about him in a few minutes. And so I'm glad you brought him back up to my consciousness, and I might not be able to sleep tonight with all the nightmares picturing his face. But it is such a perfect encapsulation of how this whole thing works, right? So let's start small and then we can kind of take it bigger. I mean, I started the investigation that became Winners Take All because I observed something that didn't make sense to me, right? I had a question. And the question was, how is it that we live in this time in which rich and powerful people are giving back more than's ever been given away before? Young people who are elite graduates of top universities are starting social enterprises to help this African country or go to that South American country and change this and change that. You have, this real effort by companies. Every company's got to have a CSR, corporate social responsibility program, so on and so forth. The worse the company, the kinder its CSR initiative and the more prominently displayed in the website. You've got a company that like kills people in its business model with opioids or something like that, then it's like a really prominent display of philanthropy.
Sure.
And you know that too in Connecticut. So I started to wonder how all of that sits alongside the fact that those same plutocrats were only increasing their share of the nation's wealth and power every year, actually increasing their share of the pie, hoarding more and more wealth and power, and the American mobility structure was melting down, and so on and so forth. And the answer I came to through reporting is that the giving back that these folks do isn't just a drop in the bucket that's failing to deliver against our biggest problems. It is helping to uphold our problems, because what these folks do is give just enough and give in certain ways to protect a bad system that benefits them and hurts most people. So now take the Dalio thing. All the things I write about in the book are displayed in this one little incident. First of all, you got a rich guy who's made money through an indefensible industry, the hedge fund industry. I know it's going to, hurt feelings in Connecticut, but let's be real. An industry that is responsible for financialization of the American economy and so much of the destruction of the American economy. If you're one of those people who feels the economy is not working for you, people like Ray Dalio are a big part of why. Okay, so you start with those economic sins. Then you make a donation like this, which gets way more publicity than decades of what you actually did to working people through your hedge fund. So that works. So you there's an erasure. That's the first element, right? Suddenly the modest do-gooding is a louder and more visible public story than what you did to harm the society, make the money. Okay. Then you got the second element, which is strings attached. Now you tell Connecticut, I'm going to give you this money, but you got to do this. You got to do this. You got to hire people I like. You got to do this. You got to have the curriculum like this. I don't know. I had my first kiss in college under the chemistry building arch. So you got to put some money on chemistry. My uncle got this disease, so you got to fund, doctors who study that disease. This is how rich people operate. So you got the strings attached. So suddenly a sovereign government in the state of Connecticut, people of Connecticut, don't actually have sovereign power to shape their own education system, number two. Then you got this whole issue of lanes. Never get in a car with a plutocrat because they're always changing lanes. Elon Musk, right? Public health expert.
Well,
suddenly. Mark Zuckerberg. Going to reinvent education. Now it's Dalio, just going to swerve into the lane of education. He's got thoughts. And finally, Ray Dalio has famously written a book called Principles. I didn't even know he had any until he wrote the book. Didn't know he had any after he wrote the book. And that's the last part of this loop that I'll mention, which is thought leadership, right? You may think thought leader is a good word. It's not a good word. It's what wealthy and powerful people who want to defend the interests of wealth and power do when they want to turn their interests into something nobler, such as ideas. They write a book like that. And serious people take someone like Ray Dalio seriously, which is incredible. Put him in airports, put him in all these places. And what that does is Ray Dalio then becomes, instead of an economic predator, a guy who's helping people, a guy whose record is erased, a guy who's helping to make the state of Connecticut better, a guy who's a thought leader, who's exuding ideas into the world. And today, in the collapse of this, what we see is the utter folly, not on his part. He's doing what makes sense for someone like him to do. He should play offense. It's for us as a society to learn to play defense. And the state of Connecticut, the United States of America, should not outsource the job of making our society better to rich and powerful people who have no interest in changing the system, just in giving little scraps to actually keep it the way it is.
So here's something, though, that's maybe not just specific to Connecticut, but it comes up in this state in a huge way, and it has to do with civic culture. So whether it's Ray Dalio or the heads of any of our big financial companies, any of our big insurance companies, these companies have long and storied histories, and they employ tens and tens of thousands of people. And because they employ tens of thousands of people, they have a bit more of a civic culture flowing through them than just the person at the top. So, for instance, a few years ago, when the state was kicking around the idea of a public option, a public healthcare option that would provide lower cost healthcare to many more thousands of Connecticut residents, the head of Cigna got word of this and said, well, if you start doing that, I might pull Cigna out of here. And what that signaled to the state was, well, we don't want to lose those jobs. And the people who work here said, well, Cigna is really important to us. And so I guess I wonder, as you get beyond the Ray Dalios of the world, how do you make that change when there's so many other people who are part of this system, who are making good middle or upper middle class lives yoked up to this thing that is a part of our civic culture?
I'm sorry, there's a lot more people in Connecticut with crappy healthcare than there are people working for Cigna in Connecticut, right? The reality is this is an organizing problem and it's a political problem. The people who want to run America like a casino where they always win are actually not that numerous, right? You're right. There's an employee class that is broader than the CEO plutocratic class. That's true, but they're still a minority. And I actually don't think even they are the principal obstacle to this. All the data shows that it is the very, very, very wealthy who have captured most of the gains of the last 30, 40 years, who monopolize the attention of politicians in Washington with their donations, who monopolize decisions around incentives that states are giving, whether it's Amazon in New York or Connecticut thinking about keeping a company like Cigna or not. And I just think actually we have not mustered the courage to say we have a great country. We have a phenomenal country. And it's time that we actually played poker with these companies and these plutocrats and say, you know what? If you really want to operate your company in the United States of America, you want access to our market. It's a great market. You want to recruit from our universities, some of the best in the world. You want the protection of our courts, which are really actually excellent courts. And even Donald Trump can't change that. Then here's the price. Here's the price you got to pay. And if you don't want to pay that price, totally cool, man. Totally cool. No issue. We are 25% of the world's demand or whatever it is, but like totally no hard feelings. If our taxes are too high for you, just go live in Singapore. It's cool. You won't chew gum, but you make a little life for yourself there. And then let's see if all these people whining about higher taxes are actually as determined as they say they are to go to some far, far off country. I have no problem finding out. Let's do a real life experiment.
Well, look, but that's what happens. Not just big companies maybe playing chicken with the American public and deciding that they're not going to go to Singapore. It happens state to state all the time. This is how we get state incentives like the kind that Connecticut is playing all the time against others. I mean, everyone wants to move to Florida or South Carolina because there's no taxes there and they can pay their employees a little bit less.
But then you got to live in Florida.
And then you got to live in Florida with the hurricanes and you're going to be underwater. But
you're right. The issue between states is different than the issue between countries, right? And I should be clear about that. The way to solve this between states is a federal law that eliminates these races to the bottom, right? That's kind of the whole purpose of a federal government, right? And the most dramatic illustration of this recently is the mask and ventilator situation, where in a pandemic, New York and California are independently sending people to some warehouse in China, like fighting each other to outbidding each other to get some masks for their people, when in fact the government and in some cases being like outgunned by the United States or having stuff seized. I mean, there's crazy drama. The country should not allow states to do that, right? We are all trying to provide a basic level of existence and decency for people. And the idea that, Amazon, for example, in my state of New York, could run this auction basically, where it was getting states and localities around the country and internationally to basically outbid each other to who could offer Amazon the greatest tax break. Amazon, run by the world's literal richest man at that moment. It's just preposterous.
But it gets to the same thing as the Dalio story in a certain way, is that when you start to talk to American politicians, or a lot of the people who support American politicians, they say, well, look, I get it. This isn't ideal. We shouldn't be in a bidding war for Amazon. We shouldn't have to rely on Ray Dalio to fund our educational improvements. But what are we going to do? We don't have the money in our budget this year. And he's offering $100 million, or Jeff Bezos is offering, millions and millions of dollars. Shouldn't we get in line and do something about that? I mean, how do we break that cycle when all of these states have these really pervasive problems with just funding themselves, funding the basic social safety net?
Well, to quote my friend Hassan Minhaj, the comedian, we tax that ass. There's a lot of ways to get $100 million from Ray Dalio, and voluntary philanthropy, in which he gets to call the shots about how young children are educated in the state of Connecticut, is not the only one. You can do it through a wealth tax. You can do it by closing the carried interest loophole. You can do it by having an estate tax. And you can do it by, frankly, enforcing tax laws. God knows what kind of islands that guy keeps his money on. It seems to me his accountants are better than his barber. And, I just think there is a real conversation we need to have about taxation being fundamentally different from and better than philanthropy as a solution to our biggest shared problems. Philanthropy has some uses. There's some things you actually don't want government doing, maybe like sponsoring the arts, because it's going to be cautious and it's going to be, have a more, a bias against things that are really pushing boundaries. Maybe you don't necessarily want, there is a space for certainly philanthropy pursuing experiments that government is, just too bureaucratic to pursue. In a moment like this pandemic, there may be a case for a limited use of philanthropy to do fast things that the government may be a little slow at doing. But in general, when it comes to our biggest shared problems, how do you fix social mobility? How do you fix racial wealth gap? How do you, make America whole after 400 years of the, plunder of African Americans? None of these are problems that are going to be solved by comb-over billionaires throwing coins at us.
But you're talking specifically about that particular type of philanthropy, not the type of philanthropy where maybe millions of Americans pull together and say, we really want to have something important. I mean, look, I've made most of my career in public radio. And so for me, asking people for money in order to get, a free system of the news is that's a very simple thing. I think that makes a whole lot of sense. But the type of philanthropy you're talking about is the philanthropy that comes from the richest 0.01% telling us what to do with that money.
Yeah, and to be clear, I say this in the book, I am using a definition that's sort of the one used in the field by people who study philanthropy, which is really different from what you're describing. Philanthropy is different from charity, and it's different from the kind of giving that you're talking about, people wiring in $10 to NPR. The origin of that term and that kind of usage of it is really 100 or so years ago, when you started to have the first types of fortunes that we'd now call billionaires. They were kind of centimillionaires in those days. Rockefellers, Carnegie, Cooper, those kind of people. And they started giving back. Giving was an old tradition. All the religions say you should do it. And you had many to many giving. You did have some rich people giving more. You had feudal lords, doing nice things for the people they were also, still oppressing. But what you had in the beginning of the 20th century was something qualitatively new, which was people who had made such vast fortunes from the Industrial Revolution, just a different scale of wealth relative to regular people, that when they felt this largeness of spirit and decided to start giving back, inherently their acts of giving were quasi-governmental almost, right? They were just simply operating on a scale that is not comparable to sending $10 to the local radio station, right? If they decided they wanted to work on women's rights, they were immediately one of the biggest players in women's rights alongside national governments and state governments. And so when I speak of philanthropy and critique philanthropy, that's what I'm getting at. That's what I'm critiquing. People like the Dalios are helping to govern Connecticut. And I don't know if anybody on this chat or watching this ever voted for a Dalio. But if you didn't, you're being ruled by an unelected king. Until today, I guess.
I want to get to something else that was in the news this week that I'm pretty sure you took a look at. You see this op-ed in the Times as part of their series, "The America We Need" by Michael Strain. This is titled "The American Dream is Alive and Well. We have bigger issues than inequality." And he starts with a little thought experiment. It's very quick, and I'll read it to you. It says, imagine if you could wave a magic wand and double the incomes of the bottom 20% of Americans. Would you do it? I imagine your answer is yes. Now suppose that in order to increase the incomes of people at the bottom by a factor of 2, you had no choice but to increase the incomes of the top 20% by a factor of 2.5. Would you still wave the wand? If so, you may be less concerned about inequality than you think. So this is, Michael Strain from the American Enterprise Institute basically making a case in the pages of the New York Times. Inequality isn't really the big issue in America right now. It struck me funny. How does it strike you?
Let me see if I can just quickly read you something. Yeah, I'm just looking at the funders of AEI. It's always very helpful. Philip Morris seems to have donated quite a bit. The cigarette company, ExxonMobil, seems to have donated quite a bit. The Scaife Foundation, I presume connected to Richard Bell and Scaife, one of the great right-wing ideologues, chronicled in Jane Mayer's Dark Money. Mike, it's fine to be wrong, but to be wrong on the New York Times op-ed page is an embarrassment. Look, what Michael is doing, I understand the move, right? Because my entire book is a chronicle of the dance moves that people use to uphold plutocracy. And this is one of the dance moves. So I'll break down this particular cha-cha for you. The way it works is you do the following. You try to say that there is no connection between the people on the top and the people on the bottom. In fact, the connection may be the one Michael describes, which is the only way to benefit people on the bottom is to benefit the people on the top even more. That is creating a dynamic that is the win-win, right? The win-win dynamic. And Michael, in what I would say is a C+ intelligent version of this thesis, you can find even more articulate, intelligent versions of this thesis that are not funded by Philip Morris and ExxonMobil, that are just actually thoughts. This idea fundamentally is trying to suggest that the people down below are not down below because of the people up above. And this move is very, very important now in particular. In an age of inequality, now in the time of the pandemic, millions of people unemployed, it's very important to say, I see the people down there. I see that mobility is broken. I see that whatever percentage of Americans, half of Americans don't have $400 for an emergency expense. I see it. Otherwise, you're a crazy rich person if you say, I don't even see that stuff. People have tried that in history. It doesn't work well. Ask Marie. So you got to say you see it. It actually hurts your heart. You might, like Jamie Dimon, or you might even give a statement saying, I condemn this. I bemoan this. I am not okay with this. And I see these people. But then, crucially, you have to say, but they are not down there because I'm up here. In fact, the best way to help them, do like Mike. Lift me up, make me 2.5 times richer, and you'll help them. And in a way, if I was trying to shatter one move above all the others in the book, it was this notion of the win-win, right? Because at the heart of the story of America in the last 40 years is the notion that in many important ways, the relationship between those on top and those on the bottom was indeed one of zero sum, not positive sum. And I'll explain a couple ways in which that happens. If you are avoiding taxes, if your way of being on top is avoiding taxes by sending money to weird Caribbean islands, lobbying for the Trump tax cut, lobbying for carried interest loopholes and things like that, right? If your way of keeping your wealth is tax minimization, that is specifically money that is not going to the medical care and education and health of the people on the bottom. Those people are literally getting poorer with every tax dollar you save. If you are lobbying for bottle service public policy that is written for your private benefit in the upstairs lounge of democracy, not for the benefit of the public, people are literally being impoverished by your being in the lounge. Your being up there is the cause of their staying down there. And they are down there because you are standing on their necks.
One of the primary arguments, though, is I give my tax money to a government which is inefficient, spends it poorly, and unfortunately, in America, at the municipal level, at the state level, at the federal level, we have so many instances of that play right into the narrative that it is sometimes hard for the regular person to argue against. It's hard to say that giving those billions in tax dollars to an inefficient government might actually do something better for those people on the bottom.
Who said the government's inefficient? Who conceded that point?
I don't know that we have conceded that point, but it is certainly something that has been proven in various cases across municipalities, states, and at the federal level over time.
I think this is a complete piece of horseshit, frankly, that has no basis in fact. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you a few reasons why. First of all, if you go to very poor countries, developing countries, right, which I spent a lot of time reporting in, and you look at what is really different between the United States and these countries, the quality of the private sector is not it. Okay? You go to India, for example, private sector is as good as the private sector in the United States. People are as smart, companies are as good, business sense is as strong, great dynamic market, right? What is different in India is the system. What is different is the regulatory infrastructure. What is different is the fact that you can't go to court in India. Basically, if you're a business, someone steals your plant, you're not going to go to court and get it back. So you have to hire someone to go get, I don't know, some tough to go intimidate someone or hire someone to go bribe a politician, right? You can't, you wouldn't just sue in court, right? And the Indian parliament is not, frankly, making decisions on an evidence-based way because until recently, there's something in India called the Parliamentary Research Service, which was new. There was no factual information available to MPs about what were the consequences of the legislation. What makes us different from India is actually the quality of our governance, right? Not our people being smarter, not our companies being better. It's the quality of our systems and our laws, right? And so I would actually argue that if you look at how much richer a country like America is than a country like India, you're getting a phenomenal return on governance. You're getting way more out of it. So this is this notion that the government is all like the DMV inefficient. I'm sorry. The United States federal courts, I think cost $80 billion a year, the US federal courts. Do you know how much economic value the federal courts create? Which business generates a return on investment like the US federal courts? The US federal courts give every business person in this country a complete confidence that if someone like completely fraudulently steals your stuff, you have a place to go. Do you understand how profoundly efficient that is as an investment? Social Security, millions of old people would fall into poverty every single year without Social Security. Which business in America is getting returns like that? Medicare. Who has the overhead in the healthcare industry? Who has the overhead costs of Medicare? Are there parts of the government that are slow and inefficient? Are there some bad people going to government? Sure. Is that any different from finance? I mean, you in Connecticut, you got a bunch of hedge fund people around, private equity people around. How many of them are doing super productive things that improve the human condition every day? I spent time in Silicon Valley. You telling me all those people add value to the planet every day?
Why don't we have more faith in government? I mean, why don't we have enough faith in our government to say exactly what you said? Medicare works just fine for millions of Americans. It's actually an incredibly efficient system. Why don't we expand it so that more people have access to it?
Why? Well, I don't know why people don't believe it, but this is why I'm out here trying to tell people that they should, because there has been a story. Think about it this way. If you were a wealthy and powerful, a set of wealthy and powerful kind of robber barons who wanted to increase your share of wealth and power and protect it, guard and keep, as James Baldwin said. In addition to selling successful products, right? You would want to do several things. You'd want to try to have a monopoly in some of those sectors if you could. You'd then need to get some political power to lubricate that, make sure you kept your monopoly. You'd want some senators making sure they're not doing antitrust investigations against you. You would want, just legislators in general to be bought and paid for. you would want the, in addition, a cultural environment in which people thought that the government, which is your main antagonist, is a big business person, taxing you, regulating you. You'd want people to believe in that less and believe in you more. And that has been the cultural project ever since the Powell Memo, which is an obscure but important document from the 70s. Jane Mayer talks about all of this in her book, Dark Money, a book you should all read, that there was an explicit campaign by a group of wealthy families, in particular 5 wealthy families on the political right, Richard Mellon Scaife, who appeared to be maybe connected to the AEI guy you quoted, Mike, and others. And they specifically took on the mission, the Kochs, others, of discrediting government, defanging government, defunding government. And it worked. And I want to make this point really clear to folks listening, right? The number of folks who are actually Kochs listening to this is probably low, judging from the chat. But I would bet that there's a number of people watching this who sort of passively agree with roughly what I'm saying and generally think, social justice, want to help the least among us, but who have absorbed as a kind of secondhand smoke from the culture, this notion, the government's kind of inefficient. Like the way you described it is exactly the form that it takes in the culture, not a hostile anti-government message, which exists on, but just the sense that like government's just, not all it could be. It's kind of inefficient. It's not a good, and I'm tired of meeting that talking point on the right of government is evil with this milquetoast version on the left of like, well, it's not evil, but it's kind of slothful.
Well, let me just put a little point on it. I covered politics in this state and nationally for a long time too. You see a lot of people who are in government to do things for themselves. And that leads to an awful lot of the inefficiencies. And is
that different from any other sector of human life?
Completely take your point. And it's not different than any other sector. All I'm saying is that I think that is another piece of it, is that often government is treated by some individuals who get into government, much like business is treated by people who get into business. I'm going to get something for myself. And if I'm able to do good along the way, great. And unfortunately, there's enough people who take government in that direction that I think it lessens people's confidence in the overall system.
Sure, but the problem I have with that is you're describing something about human nature, first of all, that in any walk of human life, there will be some fraction of people who are not serious, who are corrupt, who are gaming. I actually am not sure there's any evidence that it's higher in government. I mean, if you go to the NIH, right?
Yep.
You go to the National Institutes of Health. I don't know. I would bet a tremendous amount of money that the percentage of people at the National Institutes of Health who are in it for themselves and trying to be on the take is substantially lower than their counterparts in big pharma.
100%.
In some local governments, is that the case? But I don't know. Like, I've spent a lot of time with Silicon Valley bros, right? I've yet to meet one who's actually really doing something of genuine consequence in proportion to their self-image, So I'm not sure that you can spend 30 or 40 years telling everybody government's bad, driving a lot of young people away from the idea of public service, leaving it to others, and then complaining that no one good is getting in.
I want to get to a couple questions. We got a bunch on privatization of public roles, venture philanthropy, and a question: is there an ethical way to be a billionaire? I love that question. What do you think about that? What's the ethical way to be a billionaire?
Well, I think the ethical way to be a billionaire would be to first, a lot of these folks love to ask, what can I do, right? And I kind of flip around the JFK things. I like, ask not what you can do for your country, ask what you've been doing to your country. So if you're a billionaire, you first should do a complicity audit, right? Because it may be that there are ongoing activities related to your fortune, either the company that helped made it or where your investments are, whatever, where you're actually actively doing harm right now. And we don't first need you to go do some good thing. We need you to first stop doing harmful things, right? So if your $1 billion is invested in cigarette companies, or you're a ethical billionaire who inherited it from a opioid manufacturer that's still actually selling those opioids, and you're not speaking out. Like that's one thing. Then it comes to how do you spend that money? And the challenge, the simple mantra I would use is, can you give away that money in a way that reduces your power? Right? The fundamental problem in this society is that people like you have too much power. So is it possible to give that money away in ways that reduce your power? And it's not easy, right? Even if you mean well, it's not easy. So there you could give it away. If you do the Dalio thing, I mean, obviously you're failing the test, right? You are literally asserting your right to govern Connecticut through your gift. But even if you give it to museums, you start having this say in what kind of art they do, right? The senator from Connecticut is going to give you more time if you're a donor to the biggest museum in Connecticut, and that's not fair, and so on and so forth. So thinking about what are ways to give that actually affect a net shift in power. And some of the things that looks like, just off the top of my head, if you're a rich person who donates to ProPublica, right? Nonprofit investigative journalism thing that takes on the powerful, it's pretty clear you're not getting any power from that. They're not putting your name on the top of the thing. It's not a super prestigious thing. It's not announced. No one knows who's given to ProPublica. If anything, it's going to have no effect on you, or they actually might investigate your rich friends. They might go after some tax loophole you benefit from. That's an example of a donation where I don't think you're really gaining a lot, and you're actually sort of being a little bit of a traitor to your class, right? Or you give to Citizens for Tax Justice, which is figuring out how to research and advocate for, a tax system that is worse for people like you, where you're actually serving as a traitor to your class. Or you fund, organizations that train people to get into politics in communities around the country. You don't go in and dictate some new education system to some town you've recently adopted because you drove by or something. You give money to organizations that are training people from those communities to be more effective, to have better networks, to have better skills, so that they can build power. And the consequence of them building that power is actually people like you will actually decrease as a share if they become powerful. And that's, again, the kind of giving that's putting your own privilege at risk, putting your own power at risk, and actually affecting and altering in a positive direction the balance of power in the society.
You gave this remarkable speech at the Aspen Institute a few years back. And one of the things that you said is you were kind of challenging the people who come to Aspen to think through some of these ideas in perhaps a way that they haven't in the past. As you said, our culture has turned businessmen and women into philosophers, revolutionaries, social activists, saviors of the poor. We are at risk of forgetting other languages of human progress, of morality, of democracy, of solidarity, of decency, and of justice. This idea of different languages of human progress is first of all, it's a lovely turn of phrase, but it does also speak to the idea that we seem to have decided that there's a certain way that we count our value here in America, and it's not necessarily any of those things at the end there anymore. It's not morality, democracy, solidarity, decency, or justice. It seems to have a lot to do with the stock market. I wonder if you can talk more about that idea, because those other languages do seem to be lost a bit.
Yeah, this may be a strange way to answer it, but Winner's Take All was my third book. My first book was a book about India called India Calling, and some of the the OG fans, like my mom, will have read that one. And I was a New York Times correspondent in India at a time when India was opening up the market economy. There was also a lot of government action to help poor people simultaneous to the kind of free market opening of the economy. And a lot of the human stories I told in the book were stories about some of the positive things that happen amid growth. When a country defined by social hierarchy and people kind of supposed to know their place gives way to a society defined by ambition and people wanting to end up a different station than they're born in. And so sometimes people come up to me and say, like, you seem to love capitalism in your India book and hate capitalism in your Winners Take All book. Like, what's the deal? Now, actually, there were some pretty critical notes of capitalism in the India book, and I don't think they're really safely, fairly characterized in the America book. But your question reminds me to how I square the circle, which is my kind of fundamental theory of how societies work is that they, like your body, they are defined by multiple organs coexisting and working together in a kind of symbiotic fashion. And when this is working right, the different organs support each other. If one of them gets a little weak, the others might compensate for it a little bit and help it out and get it back to strength. But, your stomach needs your brain needs your stomach, and so on and so forth. And so when I think of capitalism, the business sector, operating on one set of values, good at generating wealth, it's better to be a country with a lot of resources than a country without a lot of resources. Business sector is good at harnessing that. Then you got a kind of civil society sector that's good at calling bullshit, telling truth, holding people to account. You got a government sector that does the things the market's never going to provide, cares for the least among us, sets fair rules of the game. None of the other sectors are able to do that, right? You have a university sector where, you really want knowledge as a society, and you want the kind of knowledge that doesn't always make sense in a short-term way. You want to create some class of people who are insulated from the daily pressures of life to actually think deeper thoughts and, work on things like particle physics that may feel of very minimal use right now or tomorrow, the next day, but a cultivated society needs to have. And so you got these different humors of a society, these different organs of a body working together. And my theory of a society that is failing is when one of those organs starts to operate in a way that is inconsistent with there being any other organs in that society. Right? When the stomach starts to say, like, I'm the only game in town, no brain here, no legs here, no nervous system, it's me or nothing, right? And in India, what I was writing about, that was not capitalism at that time, right? In India, the big organ that in many ways was inconsistent with the life force of the larger body was an ancient social structure, was family culture, was the caste system, or the residues of the caste system, was ideas of hierarchy, was a sense in the country that knowing your place was the highest end in life. And so when that was this big totalizing idea, I was a fan of anything that was breaking it down. And I saw that in little ways, a bank came to town, little capitalism coming to town, and an Indian dad would say, my daughter will never work. I will not allow ladies to work. And then the dad heard that the opening salary of the bank was double his final salary as a retiree. And he was like, you know what? I've always been a feminist, right? And I celebrated that kind of thing because if money is what it takes for people to abandon thousands of years of patriarchy in their family, great. And likewise, my problem is not the existence of a business sector, the existence of capitalism. It is the existence of a kind of capitalism that behaves in this country as though it is inconsistent with the existence of government, of civil society, of an educational system that is not fully subordinate to it. I want a society in which there are many different languages of progress, to go to the quote, and those languages of progress are in a way represented by these different humors, different types of institutions. And I will always be an enemy of any of those humors, whether it's the government or academia or civil society or business trying to eat all the others.
I want to get to a question. Josh wrote a question from Facebook. He says, I've noticed for the last few years, you've gotten less patient with the idea of civility when being critical of power structures, opting more and more to humor and an explicit no bullshit approach. Is that shift in tone conscious? And if so, is it one you would advocate for people considering running for office?
It's kind of interesting. I mean, maybe I'm just tired, I think it's interesting. So I'll tell you something that happened with the book. So I went on the road in like September of 2018 with this book. It's my third book. I'd done this before, but something happened with this book that was different. I think I was very lucky with the moment that we were in, and it like caught the wind in a way that I had not experienced before in my work. And I was doing these events, and night after night in different cities doing these events. And a lot of people were coming out, and it was very exciting, but there was a heaviness to them, right? A lot of what you and I talked about today is heavy. And I started to realize that it was important to be able to talk about that heavy stuff, but to, without lightening it up, be able to have some humor in there and have some levity in there that was not about dilution of the actual message, because the message is what it is, but just stylistically to kind of vary the show a little bit and to find ways to make this stuff relatable. I mean, good teachers, find ways to make it relatable. Good writers make a big idea, expressed through a character. And so I tried to inject a little bit of that into the conversations I had. I stopped doing speeches. I started doing these kind of one-on-ones with you, like the one I'm doing with you, because to me, they're more human and you get different things each time. And I think to the deeper point of that question, I think there is sometimes, I find, a joylessness in those who want to challenge some of these fundamental power structures that hurts the cause. And I think it is a joylessness that I understand. It comes out of the pain that is animating a lot of these movements. I mean, if the stuff I'm talking about is correct, a lot of people are feeling a lot of pain. It's maddeningly stressful to not have $400 for emergency expense. It's maddeningly stressful to not know where your next meal is coming from or your healthcare situation. And so it's hard to say these should be movements of, smiley faces. But I think it's very important when you are asking people to fundamentally change their society in these political movements, that you also convey some of the exuberance of what life will be like if you win, right? The reality is, if Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren won and America was transformed in the ways that they had talked about, life would be more fun for a lot of people. I think people would have better marriages if they didn't have to be stressed about healthcare and education for their kids all the time. I think you'd read more books to your children if you didn't have to work 3 jobs. And I often feel that portraiture was not painted by these campaigns. That storytelling was not done. The goosebump strategy was not in place. And I talked to a lot of people on those campaigns privately about it who felt the same way. Often they felt their candidates were the constraint. A lot of people in the campaigns wanted to do this, wanted to actually, convey the full exuberance of a working class movement, the joy that people were conjuring in the America they wanted to create. And finger wagging is not the only register. And, so maybe I've learned a little bit of that as I've gone along myself.
But I'll also say, beyond the candidates, I think the problem is there may have been quite a bit of joy in the people who were supporting Elizabeth Warren about the future that she was presenting, or joy from Bernie Sanders supporters. But one of the problems is that if they got together in a room, they'd yell at each other about how, no, my candidate is the one who can bring that home. And there's this sense that on the left, people who are agreeing with a lot of the things you're saying can't get their shit enough together to figure out how to have a conversation about how to do the things that you're talking about.
Well, I'm not sure that's fair. I mean, there were only two progressives at the end of the thing and like 5 centrists, right? So you could argue that the progressive lane was far more consolidated. I mean, they still divided the vote, but there were 5 people on the other side dividing the centrist vote until they kind of had their Game of Thrones style, coronation of Biden. And, I unlike a lot of people, I don't think fighting in primaries is a problem. Like, I don't actually understand why people think this is a problem. That's what you're supposed to do. It's all good. Like, people come around in the end. It's all fine. You're supposed to actually have an argument. There are differences between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Like, it's worth hashing them out. People deserve to know what those choices are. I don't think it's anybody's job to step aside for anybody else. Like, I think these are fights you got to have, and you got to win them. And I think the good news for the progressive movement is that this time around, when it felt for a certain moment that Bernie might actually do it, that both he and Warren are in many ways personally limited candidates. And the reason that's good news is it means that they haven't hit the ceiling of the movement, right? Like, I think in many ways, each of them has a personal limitation that is a ceiling on what the movement was able to achieve. I think she did much better in highly educated area. I mean, she was doing great in Brooklyn where I live. You know, she just was not reaching the same people in the same way in, you know, any town in 200 miles in any direction of Brooklyn. So, you know, a relatability for someone like that, the ability to not only have plans, but to really speak in languages of patriotism and personal transformation. Those are two that I've really encouraged progressives to speak in, languages that were almost entirely absent from either the Sanders or Warren campaigns. You know, it says to me that there's several percentage points left on the table there. Bernie, you know, you have someone who, on the one hand, has an extraordinary movement. On the other hand, is a very personally constrained candidate, essentially refuses to tell his personal story. I mean, that's 5 to 10 points right there in some contests, right? The guy's got a compelling personal story. He's running against a white nationalist. His own family's murdered in the Holocaust. Won't talk about it except once or twice. He's running on healthcare for all. His mom was killed in a bad healthcare system when he was young. Basically won't talk about that at all. About half the people listening today didn't even know that. So if you're not leaving it all on the table on a candidate, you can't just blame the big media, whatever. Like, you know, and Bernie's, I think some of the paranoia, some of the closed off, you know, closeness to even those corners of the press that are actually not out to get him, the sense that everybody is out to get him. You know, I've written about some of these things with Bernie. It actually leaves me some amount of hope that you could have very politically talented, perhaps younger, perhaps more relatable, perhaps non-white candidates carrying some of these mantles that fare much better than either Sanders or Warren did.
Before we run out of time, I got to ask you about, you know, some of the ideas that are contained in your book and the ideas that you've been talking about over time. I'm wondering how you think any of it changes given the current situation that we're in. I mean, we're all thinking about things, I think, differently. We're not on the stage in New Haven right now. We're at home. We're realizing that our lives are upside down. We got to wear masks if we go to the grocery store. Things might not be normal for quite some time. How do you think this moment changes the way in which we're going to think about inequality in our society? Or does it change it at all long term?
I think what is terrifying and exciting about this moment is that it can go either way. And there's a lot of historical precedent for each of two scenarios. So if you read a book like The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, these kind of crises are often huge opportunities for power consolidation by elites, right? In the chaos, they rush in. You saw with the PPP loans that were meant for small businesses, you had big businesses monopolizing a lot of them, small businesses getting nothing. You know, you have people rushing in. When you got $3 trillion being spent on each round of stimulus, right? Regular people have no idea what's in those bills, and lobbyists are all up in there, you know, securing line items in there that are going to help line someone's pockets for decades. Fortunes are being built in this period. So that is a well-known possibility. And by the way, it's already happening. However, crises like this are also reset buttons historically, right? I think you don't get women's suffrage if you don't have World War I. I don't think you get the civil rights movement in the way you do if you didn't have World War II and you didn't send a bunch of black GIs to go fight Nazis and come home to be like, what the hell, guys? So these crises, as awful as they are often these kind of moments that shake a society loose a little bit. And a couple things happen. It becomes okay, kind of more acceptable to say you were wrong about something, right? If you're Joe Biden right now, you wanted to change your mind on Medicare for all, it would be so much more socially acceptable now in a pandemic than 2 months ago. No one would say you're a flip-flopper to Joe Biden today for doing that in a pandemic. You could just say, I changed my mind, 36 million people unemployed, like we can't tie healthcare to jobs, Medicare for all. And new coalitions become possible, but it requires real political imagination. It requires real visionaries, right? And I think people have to ask themselves, when you see a Nancy Pelosi or you see a Chuck Schumer running the Democratic Party in the Congress, is that what you're seeing? Are you seeing true vision? Do you see some of the wisest, most thoughtful visionaries of your time leading the way? Or are there other people out there that you need to raise your voice for? Because if we play this right, I actually think the moment coming out of this pandemic is going to be the ripest opportunity in a generation to end what has been the age of capital and inaugurate the age of reform. A decades-long period, of progressive reform, fighting climate, dealing with our racial legacy, rebuilding the American opportunity structure. But it is going to take a real marshaling of organizing power. It is going to take artists and writers and others to really shape the public will to want change on that scale. And make no mistake, if we don't do that, the tie will go to the powerful, right? It is only if this post-pandemic period is met with an extraordinary, ambitious outpouring of public imagination that we have a chance to make America the country we dream it to be.
We just have a few minutes left, and a lot of people were asking for some of your recommendations, books, podcasts, shows, ideas, thought leaders, people that they should look up.
Wow, that's a great one. There's so many. A really great book that I've been reading that is not current, but is really amazing to read in 2020 is, what many consider the greatest book ever written about American politics, called What It Takes, about the 1988 presidential race. And Joe Biden is running in that race also. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And it's just this epic total access chronicle. This guy was like I don't even know how he did it. He was like full access to like 8 different campaigns and deep backstory of all these people. And that's been just a really, really amazing read. I am actually in a household with a podcaster. I'll tell you about her podcast. It's called, my wife, Priya Parker, is doing a podcast, which is really helpful right now, called Together Apart, with the New York Times. And it's about how she wrote a book called The Art of Gathering, and she specializes in helping people create gatherings of all kinds. She's a conflict resolution facilitator. And a lot of it, her work is about people meeting IRL, and suddenly that's not possible. And so they created this podcast to think about when you have to do a gathering like this through a screen, which we're all doing all day long now in all kinds of ways, distance learning, meetings, whatever. How do you feel together apart with people? How do you have birthdays? How do you have weddings? How do you do all these things in this time? So that's really fun. I think the other thing to do is to get involved in Senate races right now. That's an area, we're also focused on the presidential race and will Trump or won't Trump. A lot of you don't even live in a place that is politically consequential because of our silly electoral college system. Getting involved in Senate races, other down ballot races, and getting to know and speak for candidates who are really promoting real change, not fake change, is something else that's really important. And a really fun thing that I've been doing, lastly, I'll say, not maybe quite an answer, but I have been writing, as part of my homeschooling of my 5-year-old, writing poems with him every morning. We work on a poem together. He kind of dictates phrases, and I use all of the actual phrases he says, but I kind of coach him through the flow of the ideas. And now, how would that make someone feel? What do you want to say then? And then I dictate. And sometimes he says something boring. I'm kind of like, Asian parent. I'm like, that was okay, but find a better way to say that. I go all Amy Chua on him. Good Connecticut reference. And that's been really fun. So write poems with your kids.
Somebody was asking, Lauren was asking, any journalist recommendations? Anybody you're reading?
I haven't read this book yet, but I'm very excited. Just today, Zach Carter, I know, has a new book out on Keynes, which is something I'm really, really excited about. Other books I love, the another book I love I wanted to mention to you is The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson. Is another phenomenal book that I've been recommending to people.
Anand, thanks for spending the time with us. I keep wanting to say thanks for being here, but you're there and I'm here. But we're all
here.
We're all here right now. I'm glad that we were able to meet this way. And thanks as always to the International Festival of Arts and Ideas. I do a bunch of events for Arts and Ideas every year. And I always try to say something like this. Don't take for granted that a small city like New Haven has something like this that brings people together to think and listen to concerts and to see art. We can't all get together this year in the same way that we have in the past, but please support the festival because it's really important. And not every city in America has this, got to tell you folks. So thank you for joining us, no matter where you are, whether you're in New Haven or not. And Anand, thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Thank you all so much. Thanks for joining us for our reimagined virtual festival this year. It's been fabulous to listen to you all from the control room. And please check out artidea.org for future events. And we have a little audience participation survey, so let us know how it's going. And Anand and John, thank you so much. And we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, Elizabeth.